Alright, today we're going to talk about how to solder a Sparkfun MIDI board. So here's the finished board after I did my soldering. I put some headers on here that weren't included in the kit, but I'll show you that. I used lead-free solder. I used some rubbing alcohol to clean off my parts. I used a Hakko FX-951 soldering iron. And this is what it sounds like when it's all done, hooked up to my Korg Volca synthesizer. Here's a parts list for what I used in the project. And here we go. Alright, so I got my parts laid out right here. You can see I've got a little Arduino in the background right there, because I use that to set up the pins that are eventually going to go on the Sparkfun board. I used extra long double male headers because that allows me to put test point leads for my logic analyzer, my scope, on here afterwards when I want to look at what the MIDI signals look like. So I mount it on top of the Arduino so that everything can get lined up nicely, like that. And then I go and solder it with my Hakko. So again, I'm using lead-free solder. You can see that the smoke is being pulled into a Weller fume extractor. That's just off to the right, so it doesn't get into my nose. I soldered on each end of each header first to make sure that it was in place. Now I'm going to solder in all the other pads. So the Hakko is running at 750 degrees. The lead-free solder is surprisingly flowing really, really nicely. I'm using the default tip that came with the Hakko. It's a chisel tip, relatively narrow. Okay. So now we're going to start putting the other parts on. Oh, and I cleaned it with some rubbing alcohol afterwards to get rid of some flux that comes off when you solder. So a little rubbing alcohol. And now I'm going to put on the two MIDI connectors like that. I'll use some tape to hold them down just to make sure they're up against the board when I solder them. Just like that, just masking tape. And again, solder two pins, make sure it's connected, flush with the board, and then go ahead and solder the other pins on there. Again, that Weller is taking those fumes away and passing them through the carbon filter. I hook up the next MIDI connector right there, solder 2 points, like that. Now it's important to point out that when I'm soldering these parts on, I put a little bit of solder on the tip of the iron to get some nice contact with the metal pin that I'm about to solder. That allows heat to flow out of the iron's tip into the piece of metal, and then I apply the rest of the solder not to the soldering iron tip but to the hot pin, and that allows the solder to flow on really nicely. Now I'm putting on the switches, these little push button switches. They took a little bit of finessing to get the pins in, so I used some pliers to get that in, some needle nose pliers. And there we go. I'm using the same technique of a little bit of solder on the tip of the iron, contact with the metal pin, and then heat up the pin and flow the solder onto the joint through the hot pin and not through the soldering iron. So I'm cleaning it off again with some rubbing alcohol. That's done. Now it's time to put the potentiometers on. So there's two potentiometers, and they're a little finicky. There's two main pins on there, and then there's the signal pins that go on as well, and they don't line up very well, so it took a little bit of finessing to get them in. Eventually starting with the structural pins and then getting them to go in afterwards. So use a little bit of tape to hold them on. Same technique. Heat the iron, put a little bit of solder on there, connect the pins, flow through the hot pin. Alright, so we're just about done. So here I'm going to clean it up. Using my Q-tips and some rubbing alcohol, just stuff you get at the drugstore. And looks about done. All good. Now we got to test it. So I hook it up to my LPC802 and running it out from the MIDI board and into a synthesizer. And there you have it, a working board.